It is very important for me to point out before we start that I find it extremely painful that I, a displaced Palestinian woman that can't go back and live in my own homeland, the land that has been stolen by a settler colonial state, am living on stolen land here in Australia and would be contributing unwillingly to the pain and injustice of the Aboriginal people, unless it becomes my duty and the duty of every Palestinian to make it absolutely clear that we do feel the pain of our brothers and sisters of the First Nation and believe that together we can connect both our struggles, which will no doubt strengthen and empower us all. For our resistance is significantly stronger when standing together. Our brothers and sisters of the First Nation have suffered similar atrocities to the ones that we have faced and are still facing on the ground in Palestine. And they share with us a lifelong wound that is hard to overcome. But as much as we are resisting this imposed colonization of our identity by not allowing for our minds to be colonized too, and by owning our narrative, we realize that the First Nation people have been doing exactly this for generations. And that's precisely why our discussion tonight is vital and extremely needed. Before presenting our wonderful speakers, I turn to Hilmi Dabbagh, the co-founder and the convener of BDS Australia. Over to you, Hilmi.
Thank you so much, Hiba. Good evening, everyone. Freedom, justice, and equality are three main values that drive us in life. They drive so many people without even knowing it. If humans don't have them in full, they have the right to resist and struggle until they obtain them fully. Colonial projects have been fought by the indigenous people throughout history. The international community then calls it conflict. Some people may like to call it international mafia, but that's different stuff. And this community then goes one additional step in hypocrisy and talks about peace initiatives. 75 years of academic research on the way out of conflicts tells us that without some sort of balance of power, there will be no peace deal. Of course, power here doesn't necessarily mean military power. Let's be realistic and not count on governments and international law for the short term. Against the corruptive influence of the other side, lobbies, international law means little, means very little. Those who seek justice for the Palestinians or the First Nations in Australia or the Black in the whole world in a racist system must, for the moment, not place much hope on governments or international law. They must act within the realm of civil society, building the grassroots movements as part of growing global campaigns to achieve justice. When these movements grow big enough, the governments will have to follow. The civil rights movement in the US and anti-apartheid movement in South Africa are just two examples. George Floyd incident has reminded the progressives around the world into a moment where we are further connecting our struggles across movements, borders, and generations in order to demand a more just future. Our forum tonight is within this context. On behalf of BDS Australia Committee, I would like to thank you all for coming to this forum tonight. Thank you, our panelists, for giving us opportunity to share your views on how we can move forward in achieving justice. Finally, I would like to, in particular, to thank our regular donors who do need to donate badly to be able to continue and grow campaigns. Those who are here tonight, please consider a regular donation, whatever monthly amount you can afford. A link to donate is on our website, bdsaustralia.net.au. We know that our opponents are highly resourced and organized, but we also know that we have something they will never have. It is justice, and justice will no doubt finally prevail. Thank you. To you, Hiba.
Thank you, Hilmi. We will begin our event by hearing from our guests, and then we will move on to the Q&A discussions. I'll be starting off our conversation with our speakers. This is a landmark event for us in Australia. This is the first time that the co-founder of BDS is connecting with supporters in Australia, and the first time that he will be having a conversation with Aboriginal activists and connecting the struggles of the Aboriginal and the Palestinians. We are very privileged to have him and all our wonderful speakers. And I personally am very extremely excited about this opportunity. So I'll start our conversation with Amy Mcquire. I'll just give a little bio about Amy. Amy is a Darumbal and South Sea Islander woman from central Queensland with 13 years experience in the Indigenous media sector, currently completing her PhD at the University of Queensland into media representation of violence against Aboriginal women. She's also a freelance writer and journalist. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to also acknowledge the lands of which I'm speaking on tonight, the land of my ancestors, the Darumbal people. I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous nations in which we're all speaking or listening from today, and acknowledge your ancestors and elders, whether it be here in occupied Australia or occupied Palestine. I also want to say how honoured I am to be invited to this forum by BDS Australia to hear from Omar, Randa and Uncle Tony Birch. I feel very humbled to be asked to speak alongside such an esteemed panel on what I see as a critically important non-violent resistance movement, which is BDS. Earlier this year, the death on camera of African-American man George Floyd by police galvanised the world, including Australia, who was suddenly woken from their apathy to the callous disregard shown towards Black lives overseas. Aboriginal people over here, though, were quick to point out that Black lives matter on our own shores too. And in fact, there has been a long history of protest and resistance, which had been largely silenced or completely ignored by mainstream Australia. Australians did not want to hear about this protest because they themselves were complicit in it and prospered from the systems that were founded upon the killing of Aboriginal people, the dispersals from our country, the attempted decimation of our family units, and the containment and killing of Aboriginal men, women and children, both in the carceral system and outside of it. And this has continued over the past 200 years. We were quick to point out that if Australians cared about Black lives overseas, they must also care about them within our own country too, because our struggles are united and our solidarities against racial injustice and violence and settler colonialism are intrinsically linked. And just like the Black Lives Matter movement, I feel that our struggles as Aboriginal people are also linked with Palestinian movements. Just like the Palestinian people, we are treated as second-class citizens in our own land. Just like the Palestinian people, we've been victim to systems of apartheid that we're still living under today, albeit by different names here. And just like the Palestinian people, we've been deprived of our traditional countries and lands and seen them destroyed in front of our eyes. And I really feel when I hear Palestinians talk about the right of return, I feel that we really feel that in our souls as Aboriginal people as well. As I was thinking about what I wanted to say tonight, I kept coming back to one case because I feel it shows just how movements like BDS are movements that involve us as Aboriginal people, and many of you may already know about this case. Every year, Australians participate in acts of jingoism and national displays of forgetting on Australia Day, January 26th, which for them represents a founding of a country, but for us represents the beginning of successive invasions into our lands and everything that came afterwards. But on one particular Australia Day in 2008, an Aboriginal man and respected elder named Mr. Ward was arrested for drink driving and taken into custody overnight after being refused bail. The next day, he was placed in a prison transport van in the Western Australia summer and transported the 4.5-hour-long journey from Laverton to Kalgoorlie. Mr. Ward would not make it. He died in custody, and it was a horrendous death. The prison van was not suitable. It did not have proper air conditioning, and the security guards escorting him did not care enough to conduct any checks. The heat outside was 40 degrees. Mr. Ward died of severe heat stroke with a 3rd-degree burn. He was killed in what was effectively a makeshift oven. He was yet another Black death in custody in a country that kills Aboriginal people inside at staggering rates. The security company that held the contract for the prison vans was G4S, the same security company that has profited through its contracts in Israeli prisons and has had its hands in Israeli police training, checkpoints, and the illegal settlements, as well as which has been targeted for international law violations against Palestinian political prisoners within its operations. G4S was never held criminally accountable for the death of Mr. Ward. Instead, they were given a measly fine that seemed so inadequate in comparison to the loss that Mr. Ward's family and community endured. Mr. Ward was a father, a husband, a proud community man, and an accomplished artist and respected elder. He had fought long and hard for his country using the only form of land rights in Western Australia, native title, however imperfect it was. He had been brought up as a respected cultural man, and his loss not only meant his absence, but the fear that that cultural knowledge would not be transmitted. The fact he died after being incarcerated on Invasion Day said so much about the way Australia continually devalues Aboriginal lives and how there are two laws for black and white. While the rest of Australia partied on beaches and drank the day away, it was Mr. Ward who was arrested, and it was Mr. Ward who died. We still have private security companies operating institutions that hurt and kill Aboriginal people. Earlier this year, Australia's largest private jail was opened in Grafton, with barely a peep. It's a $1 billion prison operated by private security firm Serco, and it is a jail that will ultimately warehouse Aboriginal people at disproportionately high rates, with little accountability or oversight. Our struggles as Aboriginal people and Palestinian people, as well as Indigenous and Black people all across the world, are united when we consider what our presence on our land means to those who profit from it. And yet there is a deliberate attempt to silence us because we represent this threat to them. Part of the silencing involves the obscuring of the perpetrator. And in Australia, we see this in the hundreds of Black deaths in custody like Mr. Ward. The obscuring of the perpetrator means that these deaths are seen as aberrations of the system rather than the system working, rather than the system doing what it is supposed to be doing. It means that our lives and the resistance of Aboriginal people are made invisible and our deaths are seen as our responsibility. It means that the multiple forms of overlapping and intersecting violence is seen as legitimate, and these acts of violence are also legitimated. This is why movements like Aboriginal resistance movements, those who organise protests, or those who are just quietly working within their communities in their own capacities and with their own people, as well as Palestinian movements like BDS, are so critical. They recenter the aspirations of our people, both Black and Palestinian, and they are a display of our survival and an assertion of our presence. They are a declaration that we are still here and we will not go away. In closing, I just want to say that I've seen Palestinian writers and activists being silenced on our own shores. I've seen how hard it is to get Palestinian issues that privilege Palestinian voices published in even progressive publications and occasionally even in Indigenous media. And so I've seen how hard I feel that we share this as well, the continual silencing of our people and our struggle, the co-option of our struggles as well. And so I just want to offer my solidarities to the Palestinian people, and I feel that solidarities, it's something that we have to continually work towards, and we have to put the work behind it. So thank you so much for listening to me tonight. And again, I'm just so humbled to be here and be involved in this panel and to continue to work to building those solidarities, because it really is a global struggle. We're all facing a very similar fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was just absolutely great. Definitely, it's with voices like yours and other Aboriginal activists. With voices like yours, there is always hope that there will be an end to all this injustice that we share with you, and we feel and we experience on the ground as well in Palestine. I'll turn now to Randa. She's our next guest speaker, and I'll say a little bio about Randa as well. Randa Abdulfattah is a writer and a scholar of Islamophobia who is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Mcquire University in Sydney. Randa is also a prominent Palestinian Egyptian Muslim and anti-racism advocate. She is a multi-awarded winner, author of 11 novels published in over 20 countries. Randa is known to many of you as a writer, activist, and a fierce defender for the Palestinian rights. I welcome Randa Abdulfattah to talk to us. Randa is currently speaking to us from the land of the Darug people of the Eora Nation. Welcome, Randa.
Thank you for having me, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Darug people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I too am extremely honoured to be part of this forum today, especially because the work of Amy and Tony and Omar has been really, really influential in my own trajectory in understanding our shared struggles. So for me, it's a real privilege to be here. I want to talk a little bit today about narratives and about the narrative of settler colonialism in our shared struggle. In his groundbreaking book, Silencing the Past, Michel Rolfe Trullo argued that the West's failure to acknowledge the Haitian Revolution shows us that history is not simply the recording of facts and events, but a process of actively enforced silences, some unconscious, others quite deliberate. The settler colonial logics underpinning the establishment and continuing logics of Israel as an ethno-national state established on the land of the majority of Palestinian population is routinely silenced and suppressed in public political discourse, government policy and mainstream media in the West. It is also routinely erased in any understanding of how the governance regimes of Australia as a white settler state are shaped and coextensive with colonial origins. What I'm interested in is what is at stake in upending this history, in naming the reality of Israel as a settler colonial enterprise, in framing justice for Indigenous people in terms of a deep and systematic project of decolonisation. What and who is threatened when we assert that the struggles of Indigenous people here and Palestinian people there are united in an indivisible anti-colonial struggle. Silencing the overarching framework of settler colonialism accounts for why we continually see an inversion of responsibility in Australia and Palestine, whereby the white settler state here and the Israeli settler state there shifts blame from the enactors of state violence to the victims. So Palestinians refuse to acknowledge Israel's so-called right to exist as an ethno-national state. Palestinians refuse to capitulate, give up their right to return. All these attempts to shift blame, whether it's in Oslo or peace talks or blaming Palestinian leadership or Arab states, are in effect a silencing of the Nakba, because the settler relies on this silence of leaving the conditions which enabled it to move from colonizer to settler, ethnic cleansing, depopulation, dispossession, massacres in the past. Liberal Zionists are fabulous at doing this. The starting position is always negotiating your claim down to a single room in a home. The question of ownership over the house, the circumstances of entitlement, theft, dispossession are always erased. In Australia, we see the ongoing failure of the state to take responsibility for colonial harms, the systematic and institutionalised state violence and brutality against Indigenous people, for example, intergenerational poverty, and the history of stolen wages and blackbirding. Indigenous people are blamed for their poverty, blamed for their shorter life expectancy. The results and the continuing logics of colonialism are mere lifestyle choices. Despite the official apology for the stolen generations, the rate of removal of Indigenous children has actually increased. Sorry means you don't do it again. And yet we have groups like Grandmothers Against Removal working against the systemic removal of Indigenous children because the language of terra nullius subtly permeates this saviour discourse. In the child protection sector, we see a consistent thread of the logic of the colonial protection authority. So a failure to recognise that the original rights to control Indigenous children underpins law and policy is part of this erasure of settler colonial histories. A deep historical reading of both struggles as anti-colonial struggles problematizes many hegemonies. And one of these is that the European, Western prism of modernity and its refusal to engage with the colonial matrix of power. And this is fundamental to my positionality as a settler of colour, as the daughter of a dispossessed Palestinian living on stolen land. The colonial project that created the state of Israel and dispossessed my father and his family from their homeland brought my father to another stolen land here. A historical analysis is crucial in order to achieve justice and social transformation. And we know this here, as Amy was speaking about with Australia Day, white Australians telling Indigenous people to get over it, that it's in the past, deaths in custody, as though the toll starts from the Royal Commission report of 1991 and not the historical trajectory beyond 1991 since 1788. In Palestine, we are always starting as though we need to start from 1967, which automatically signals an ideological position that settler colonialism is extinguished from your narrative, but it is everything. I mean, when we look back at the history, the fact that Herzl wrote to Cecil Rhodes, who colonized the land of the Shona people in Africa, and actually said, and actually pleaded with him on the basis that it is something colonial. History matters to both First Nations people here and Palestinians. Cecil Rhodes is seen as having provided the blueprints for apartheid South Africa. And South Africa's apartheid system was modelled closely on Queensland's Aboriginal Protection Act of 1897. This is the settler colonial matrix of power that is deliberately silenced and not taught to children in schools and in universities, and on it goes. What we are witnessing in Palestine and Australia are extensions of settler colonial violence. Every attempt to frame this as a two-state solution, for example, or anti-Zionism being conflated with anti-Semitism, or that this is a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews, is a deliberate attempt to redact the historical record. Likewise, in Australia, we see time and time again that white settler state violence is the engine behind martial law in the Northern Territory intervention in Indigenous deaths in custody, the carceral system that disproportionately imprisons Black lives and Black bodies, the system that shuts down Indigenous dissent and protests. Last week, 28-year-old Australian Brenton Tarrant was sentenced to life imprisonment for his massacre of 51 Muslim worshippers in New Zealand in March 2019. And I watched survivors present their victim statements to the court, and it was harrowing. But as I followed mainstream media coverage, I was not surprised that, like the commentary that circulated a year earlier, the very macro structures of settler colonialism that the Christchurch shooting is grounded upon were completely disregarded. We had here a white supremacist terrorist attack committed by a white Australian male against Muslims in a neighbouring settler state, and yet public conversation remains fixated on the false idea that white supremacy is an ugly aberration, an anomaly to Australia and New Zealand's "we are better than this" kind of attitude. It is, to quote Indigenous professor Aileen Moreton-Robinson, an example of how the possessive logics of patriarchal white sovereignty operate to perpetually disavow and disappear Indigenous people. These are left out of these public conversations. Aileen Moreton-Robinson also says that the unfinished business of Indigenous sovereignty continues to psychically disturb patriarchal white sovereignty. And it is not a stretch. In fact, it is arguably a diagnosis we have historically seen play out over and over again, that settler violence, whether by a white Australian terrorist or by gun-wielding settlers in New York with New York accents in the West Bank or the alleys of Hebron, is rooted in this psychic disturbance. The late Patrick Wolfe powerfully argued that settler colonialism is a structure, not a past event. The racial violence against Indigenous people and Palestinian people is enacted through ongoing structures of settler colonialism, which are based on this historical matrix of power. Consider the response to the Great March of Return protests in Gaza in 2018. These were largely represented as a response to Trump's embassy move and not rooted in the right of return of Palestinians imprisoned in Gaza to their 48 homes. Likewise, when Indigenous people protest deaths in custody and the failure of a single law enforcement officer ever being held responsible, what are we talking about here? Fundamentally, settler colonialism is a structure of unaccountability for the destruction of Black and brown lives. I mean, there are lots of theoretical sort of theories about, grievable lives, as Judith Butler calls it, or Raymond Williams, structures of feelings, but I think this is really key. This idea of empathy and recognition of the value of the life of the other is socialized in emotional regimes, and in states built on settler colonial logics, Indigenous people can die in custody. Indigenous children can be turned away from hospital, as Amy reported last week, and die of poisoning, and nobody can be held accountable. Indeed, the conditions and the decisions and actions which cause such deaths are animated by the structures of feeling that Indigenous lives are less worthy. And how can we be surprised by this when this is a country built on racial violence? Likewise, Palestinians at checkpoints, imprisoned in Gaza, treated as second-class citizens, killed with impunity. This is how you deal with that part of a population you could not ethnically cleanse, you could not remove when the original project of a Jewish ethno-national state was first executed. And this is why this analytical framework is so threatening and psychically disturbing to white supremacists and Zionists, because it is a framework that instantly opens up a powerful, unyielding, transnational collective solidarity movement. And we can see that here today. This is what people are afraid of. They are afraid of what going back to this historical colonial matrix can do to our solidarity movement, which is take it from something that is singular and isolated and open it up to a global enterprise for decolonization and liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Randa. I now turn to Professor Tony Birch, who is known to many of you. Professor Tony Birch is an author of 3 novels, the best-selling The White Girl, winner of the 2020 New South Wales Premier Award for Indigenous Writing, and shortlisted for the 2020 Miles Franklin Literary Prize, Ghost River, winner of the 2016 Victorian Premier Literary Award for Indigenous Writing, and Blood, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. In 2017, he was awarded the Patrick White Literary Award for his contribution to Australian literature. He is also an activist, historian, and an essayist. Professor Birch is talking to us from the Wurundjeri Nation. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone for being involved tonight. So I want to firstly pay my respect to the other speakers. Clearly, I want to pay my respect to BDS Australia for organising this event. I think it's a remarkable gathering, and I think that I feel very privileged to be asked to be involved in this and take the privilege very, very, very seriously. I am speaking on Wurundjeri land, so I want to pay my respect to Wurundjeri elders, past and present. And in introducing myself, I'm an Aboriginal man who grew up in Melbourne. I generally like to be introduced as a Fitzroy Black, which I took from the late and great Sammy Watson, who used to love to call himself a Brisbane Black. But essentially it's to say that I grew up in inner Melbourne, and I lived in the suburb of Fitzroy, which had historically the strongest Aboriginal urban community in Victoria. And it's where I grew up, and it's where I like to claim that I belong, regardless of us claiming traditional land. It's where I learned to be an Aboriginal person, where I learned about my culture. But I also want to pay respects that I'm part of I suppose, a diaspora of enslavement. My great-great-grandfather was from Barbados, a man called Prince Moody, and he was transported from Barbados to Van Diemen's Land, which became Tasmania. And his crime for 14 years enslavement was that he committed the crime of disobedience in Barbados. He left his family in Barbados and married into an Aboriginal family here. And I also want to pay respect to my great-grandfather on my mother's side of the family, a man called Bhutta Khan, who was from the Punjab, a Muslim man who came to the colony of Victoria in the 1890s. And he was a man subject to regular humiliation by the Australian government, having to get an exemption from the infamous dictation test just so that he could take my great-grandmother and her children back to the Punjab to meet his own family. So I suppose that I see my role as an activist, not as a choice, but something in my blood, something inherent to me. As Amy called me uncle at the start of this, I'm going to talk a little slowly tonight, so I'll play the uncle role for Amy Mcquire. I want to start off by saying something a little more general, and that is the issue of sovereignty and how it impacts on us as Indigenous people and how we should deal with it. We're currently in a situation in Australia where discussions of treaty are being held in different states in Australia, and I think very shallow discussions of treaty, by the way, that really won't, in my opinion, bring anything of substance to Aboriginal people. And one of the things that I believe and that I've written about, and then certainly Aboriginal elders that I respect have spoken about for a long time, is that sovereignty is not something that we will be granted by the Australian government or by a state government. We are sovereign people. We are inherently sovereign people, and we are sovereign under the law of Aboriginal nations and Torres Strait Islander nations across this land. And it's important for us to recognise that we don't need to go cap in hand to a government, as the people in Palestine shouldn't have to go cap in hand to an occupying force and ask that our sovereignty be recognised. The fact is we must always assert it. And I think I say that with both confidence and a need to give myself strength and provide strength to other younger Indigenous people. It is to say you are sovereign. Don't ask for sovereignty, you are sovereign. With that in mind, I think that the next point about that I like to raise is for those of us who can afford to speak, those of us who have relative freedom, is that we need then to take on that responsibility of being sovereign, and that responsibility encompasses what happens on our country. How are people treated on our country? Not only how our own Aboriginal people are treated on our country, but how are guests treated on our company? How are migrants treated? How are refugees treated? So therefore, for someone like me, taking on the role of taking the interests, the human rights, social justice interests of other people who live on my country is absolutely central to who I am as a person. Now, I understand that for many Indigenous people who are suffering because of racism, that can be endemic poverty, that can be incarceration of family, that can be all sorts of intergenerational trauma. We can't expect each of us to carry that weight. Dealing with our own issues are certainly difficult enough. So I'm not making a claim that all Aboriginal people need to take on that overt responsibility of care for others. But what I do say is that those of us who can, because of whether it be good health, relative wealth, relative ability to speak in public, relative ability to connect up with people, we need to take that responsibility very seriously. So my first point is to say, part of my feeling privileged to be here tonight, it allows me to be a sovereign person and to act on that accordingly. That then, of course, relates specifically to Palestinian people, not only living in Australia, but thinking about all of your family, your community, and your nation at home. So when I then think about where my responsibility lies, it not only lies to people such as yourselves who may have migrated to Australia, or your parents would have migrated to Australia, but your home community in Palestine, your home nation in Palestine. And I note that both Randa and Hiba talked about, Hiba, you mentioned unwillingly living on stolen land and being part of that colonial process. Randa, you also talked about moving from your parents or family moving from Palestine and being part of a sort of settler colonial process. What I'd like to say about that is I feel genuinely humbled by that. I think it's a wonderful thing for you to say. But as an Aboriginal person, I always want to say that I understand the recognition you give in relationship to that, but you don't have to be accountable to us to that. I don't think you have to feel, we don't want you to carry the guilt that the settler colonial nation should carry. What we love is the recognition that you give to us as sovereign people, and therefore you're reciprocating in a way that I think is really important for us to be able to link up. So I thank you for what you've said. What I want to say now is that it's important for us to speak with and act with the Palestinian people, because one of the things that we find quite annoying is that the notion of the Australian governments and the mainstream media's sort of adherence to human rights is very selective, it's very strategic, and it is not universal in any way. So that we know at present the federal government and a lot of media coverage has been given to the protests in Hong Kong, and yeah, they are legitimate protests, and there's some very brave young people involved in those protests. But the fact that our Prime Minister, the fact that mainstream media gives so much attention to those issues and yet ignores the decades of murder and atrocity committed against not only Palestinian people, but other people of colour, it shows a gross hypocrisy in that position. And therefore, it's not a position that we can take seriously. So one of the claims I want to make as an Aboriginal person is to say, we need to ensure that the human rights of all people who live on our country, all people who live on our land, who come from elsewhere, that we need to give equal attention to those people. We also need to suggest that in relationship to Palestinian people and Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, as has already been stated, there is something very common, and that is the aspects of settler invasion or evasion that have led to the destruction of our homes, the destruction of people, and destruction of culture. Now, I think as Randa has already alluded to, these are historical injustices that go back a long, long way. One of the things, though, a key moment for me, I suppose, is to think about what has happened in what we might call the post-war era. And here I'm talking about post-Second World War. So if we look at the establishment of the State of Israel, if we look at the move of what's called in Australia post-war assimilation, what else is very common in these aspects? It's the destruction of identity. And one of the things I'm very interested in is that I often ask the question, if you can take someone's land away from them, why do you still continue to try and destroy that people, destroy their culture, destroy the physical body? And I think what it is that both with the government of Israel, both with repeated Australian governments, is what those ideologies recognise is that you can take as much land as you want off of people, and although that is very destructive to those people's well-being, people will still hold themselves together because they have family, they have community, they have a nation, and they will not give up the struggle as long as they have a body to struggle with. So that one of the things that I've recognised in both what has happened in Australia, and it's been alluded to again by the previous speakers around incarceration, around stolen children, around the imprisonment of people in Palestine, is in fact the need to humiliate and destroy the body, to devalue the body in a way that a colonial society gives no worth or value to that person in a sense to try and destroy who you are. I saw a photograph a couple of weeks ago which resonated very strongly with me, and it was of a Palestinian woman trying to rebuild her house. And in the process of trying to rebuild her house, she was confronted by Israeli soldiers. As she tried to build the house, they were destroying the house. So it was this sort of standoff of this really strong woman. It made me think of what happened here in Victoria, and certainly where Amy's from, and in New South Wales, of Aboriginal women taking up the struggle to keep family together, to keep household together throughout the 20th century. So I could talk about, although we don't have time, of many, many instances of Aboriginal women seeing their houses burnt to the ground, of many, many Aboriginal women writing letters of struggle, complaint, protest to government, and being told if they wrote one more word of protest, if they opened their mouth one more time, that they would receive no ration, that their children would be banished from a reserve or mission. This is very similar to what has happened in Palestine, and that is to attack the family. Regardless of how much land you take, you must attack the family, you must destroy the family. And the very fact is, of course, we know that has been a complete failure. So I want to turn to, I suppose, what is the central point that comes out of all of that for me. And that is that we know that one of the processes of dispossession, one of the processes of the destruction of a people is to isolate, to humiliate, and to, in a way, defeat people through a sort of a process of in the end, people giving up a struggle because they have nothing else that they can give. I've been at times quite depressed about the situation in Australia. I've been at times quite depressed about the struggle for Indigenous rights. What always gets me out of that depression is other people around me. So the important aspect for me has always been throughout my life to ensure that I continually connect up with like-minded people who I know will stay with me, who I know will continue to fight for the rights of our people. I want to extend that to the guests tonight, and I want to extend that to the people of Palestine. Last year in November, I was very fortunate to be invited to speak at another event of Black Palestinian Solidarity that was held at the University of Melbourne. And we brought together scholars, teachers, thinkers, artists from all over the country and from overseas. And it was one of those great moments of meeting people that you knew, but also being introduced to new people, being introduced to people with great ideas, great foresight. And what I found over those 2 days of being involved in that conference is that, and anyone here who's been a public speaker or an educator knows this, when you walk into a room and you give a lot of energy, but that is not reciprocated, you feel very drained at the end of whether it be a lecture, a talk, a day's teaching or whatever. What I found in that 2 days is that when I walked out of each session, when I walked out at the end of each day, I felt completely energized by what I'd experienced. So when I gave my presentation and was involved in the discussion, rather than sometimes after talk you feel a bit drained, I actually felt full of energy because of the generosity of the people who were in the room with me. So what I want to say at to end in as an opening is that this is the way forward. We must ensure that we take care of each other, that this struggle is a lifetime struggle. When I speak to younger activists and they talk about how difficult situations can get and how demoralizing situations can get, and I fully accept that, I always say to them, just think back that in 1915, an Aboriginal woman sitting in a reserve, an Aboriginal reserve where she'd been imprisoned, and she was told if she raises her voice one more time, she will get no food, her house may be taken from her, and she could be put out with nothing, that woman sat at her kitchen table, got a brown paper bag out of the drawer, the old-fashioned brown paper bag, got a pencil and wrote a letter on that brown paper bag demanding land rights for her people, demanding human rights for her people, demanding that her children be fed adequately, and demanding the government recognise that she's an Aboriginal woman on her own country. And then she mails that letter to the Premier of Victoria, knowing that she could be silenced, she still does it. So what we need to know is those who come before us, whether it be in Palestine or in Australia, those that come before us have done remarkable things. And if we don't carry on that struggle, we are doing an injustice and a disservice and paying disrespect for those who came before us. So I just feel lucky to be involved in this, and I don't find it difficult because I find that whether it be you people here or other people I work with, I feel very fortunate to be able to speak at all. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for a wonderful, wonderful talk. And I suppose a colonial society wouldn't only take the land, and it would go on destroying the oppressed people's identity, trying to destroy it, only because they are a constant reminder of all the terrible atrocities that colonizer has done in the past and is still doing. So thank you very much for that. Now our next guest speaker doesn't need any introduction. It is my personal honor to welcome Omar Barghouti to this discussion. But knowing that most of you would probably know enough about Omar, I still feel I need to read a little bio about Omar. Omar Barghouti is a Palestinian human rights defender and the co-founder of the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, BDS movement for Palestinian rights. He is a co-recipient of the 2017 Gandhi Peace Award. He holds a bachelor and master's degree in electrical engineering from Columbia University and a master's in philosophy from Tel Aviv University. He is the author of BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights. I welcome Omar, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. I'm truly honored to be invited to this excellent panel and to share this platform with Amy, Randa, and Tony. I'm really privileged. Thank you. So my talk is titled Together We Rise. In her poem titled Australia's Silenced History, Indigenous poet Nola Gregory wrote, Australia's dark and cloudy past was built with hate and fear. How could you stick a flag in dirt and then claim no one was here? For 60,000 years we roamed the country of our birth. Then along you came with guns in hand and killed our hope and worth. End of quote. Killing hope and worth of the Indigenous people is in the DNA of settler colonial regimes. The South African Black consciousness leader, Steve Biko, once wrote, quote, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Indeed, our oppressors do not colonize our lands only, they simultaneously and relentlessly strive to colonize our minds, to sear into our consciousness an abject sense of hopelessness, as was mentioned by Tony, through dehumanization, isolation, and violent crushing of any resistance with disproportionate force and premeditated savagery. Beyond genocide and ethnic cleansing, European settler colonial regimes have relentlessly sought not simply to subjugate our surviving indigenous communities, but to disappear us altogether, erasing or appropriating our past, our heritage, incarcerating our present, and condemning our future to implicit slavery. Israel's brutal regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid is a vivid example. As early as 1923, some 25 years before Israel was created through the planned massacres and ethnic cleansing of most of the indigenous Palestinian Arabs, Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky wrote with lucid honesty, quote, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized." He continues, "Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach," end of quote. And that iron wall, of course, that Israel has incessantly been trying to build in our minds is one of despair and acceptance of subjugation as fate. From its siege and repeated bombing of the 2 million Palestinian sisters and brothers in Gaza, to its land-grabbing construction of illegal settlements and gradual ethnic cleansing, especially in occupied Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, and the Naqab or Negev, Israel has for decades been perpetrating war crimes or crimes against humanity. This is what our ongoing Palestinian Nakba looks like. This is what colonizing our minds with hopelessness looks like. But we continue to exist, to resist, and to insist on a life that is worth living, or what South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu calls the full menu of rights. 15 years ago, the broadest coalition in Palestinian society launched the global BDS movement for Palestinian rights to contribute to our liberation struggle. BDS calls for peaceful pressure on Israel's regime of oppression and the institutions and corporations that are complicit in maintaining this regime until we achieve our inalienable rights to freedom, justice, equality, and the right of return for refugees. Israel's far-right regime has spared no financial, political, legal, propaganda, or espionage efforts in waging war on our peaceful movement, but it has failed to even slow down the steady growth of the impact of BDS worldwide. Major trade union federations, political parties, progressive grassroots networks, Black, Latino, indigenous justice groups, women's movements, student groups, LGBTQI groups, progressive Jewish groups, among others from the global south to the north, have endorsed BDS or called for targeted sanctions against Israel, including military embargo on it. The cultural boycott of Israel, another aspect of BDS, is growing steadily. Celebrity singers like Lana Del Rey, Shakira, Lorde, and others were among other top artists to cancel concerts in Israel, while more than 100 electronic music artists joined the cultural boycott under hashtag DJs for Palestine. Instead of attracting the anticipated 50,000 tourists, Eurovision in Tel Aviv last year attracted some 5,000 only. Major corporations like Veolia and Orange suffered major losses or reputational damage due to BDS campaigning, including in Australia, forcing them to completely abandon their illegal projects in Israel. The city of Dublin in 2018 became the first European capital to adopt BDS for Palestinian rights. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib made history by becoming the first two sitting members of the US Congress to publicly endorse BDS and survive. Tens of cities, cultural institutions, and public spaces in the Spanish state, Italy, Belgium, Norway, Ireland, and elsewhere have expressed support for Palestinian rights by declaring themselves apartheid-free zones, calling for arms embargoes against Israel, or excluding from public tenders corporations that are implicated in Israel's human rights violations. As Israel's popularity continues to decline worldwide at the grassroots level, defenders of Israeli apartheid, especially in other settler colonies like Australia, Canada, and the US, have desperately invested massive political and financial resources in the last few years to suppress speech on Palestinian rights, as was mentioned by Amy, and demonize BDS. Through intimidation, spying, and weaponizing claims of anti-Semitism, they're trying to keep Israel on a pedestal, as Desmond Tutu once said, above accountability and beyond censure. In response to their smears and intimidation, we continue to defend our right to freedom of expression and against repression. They attack, we fight back. They oppress, we BDS. Since BDS was launched, we've been conscious that our liberation is organically tied to the liberation of other oppressed communities worldwide. BDS has worked to foster bonds of mutual solidarity with movements for indigenous, racial, social, economic, gender, and climate justice. Our movement categorically rejects all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. We target complicity, not identity. There is nothing Jewish about Israeli apartheid, therefore there's nothing anti-Jewish in targeting Israeli apartheid. Together, we rise. To Palestinians and many other oppressed communities, Black Lives Matter matters in a very profound way as a unique source of hope and inspiration. Not only is the struggle for Black liberation inherently important to humanity, it is also organically intertwined with global struggles for justice, including ours. Nick Estes, a Native American scholar, activist, and co-founder of the Red Nation in the US, recently said, quote, "This is an incredible moment in time. The indigenous movement, the Black movement, the Palestinian movement have seen levels of solidarity, because primarily of Black Lives Matter, that we haven't seen in the past. Even our history to this moment is deeply connected," end of quote. To end, we rise together against all oppressors and all racisms, and we hold on to our heritage of intersectional struggle, our humanity, and our dignity. Tyrants are terrified of memories, said Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. Memories, after all, nourish our hope that we can be whole again. They inspire us to rise again and again, and they remind us that no matter how cruel their oppression may get, we can and shall overcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. You have mentioned before that in the fight for justice, it is vital and it is highly important that we see the connections between struggles, and we need to study them very well and try and see the connections between all these struggles. And you've done that beautifully in your address to us today. I will start now asking some questions to our speakers, and then after that we'll turn to the Q&A from the audience. But for now, we'll start with my questions to you first. My first question I will be addressing Omar Barghouti, please. In terms when any criticism of Israel is viewed falsely as anti-Semitic, when BDS is an anti-racist movement, as we all know, and it has been known to have a special appeal to the world, yet Israel tries to convince the world that it is an anti-Semitic movement. How can you explain this to our audience? What is the message that you would like to send to activists as well as to supporters and to people that might be falling victims to the Israeli false accusations and propaganda? The silencing is common in many struggles, and we know that. We realize that silencing mechanism might be similar, but the strategies that different colonizers use might be different from one colonizer to another. Would you like to explain that to us, please?
Sure, thank you very much for this, Hiba. Indeed, this is what we call weaponizing fraudulent charges of anti-Semitism to silence Palestinians, to erase our history, and to silence those in solidarity with Palestine. it's very important to know that as a movement that opposes all forms of racism categorically, we also oppose anti-Jewish racism. And Israel is very well aware of this. Jewish support for BDS is growing exponentially in the US, especially among younger Jewish Americans. Across Europe, we see many, many Jewish activists joining the BDS movement. They fully understand that this is a movement for justice. The us versus them is not Jews versus others or Palestinians versus others. It's those who want justice for everyone, irrespective of identity, vis-a-vis those who want to deprive people of justice and equality based on their identity. That's the us versus them. So progressive Jewish people are with us in this movement, are supporting us increasingly. Because Israel is very alarmed at the rates of Jewish support for BDS, they're trying to propagate a fraudulent definition of anti-Semitism that instead of caring about anti-Jewish bigotry, hate, and discrimination, which is the definition of anti-Semitism, they're trying to present the new anti-Semitism as any attack on Israel, claiming that Israel as the Jewish state, if you criticize Israel, if you say Israel is an apartheid state, Israel was created through the ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians, that's all, those are all examples of anti-Semitism. So Israel is conflating those two concepts. More than 40 Jewish groups in 2018 came out and said, we condemn this new definition. We do stand with Palestinians, and we see absolutely nothing anti-Semitic about calling out Israel's apartheid, Israel's ethnic cleansing, or any policy by the State of Israel. Israel is not equal to all Jews. Anyone claiming otherwise is an anti-Semite. Saying that Israel and all Jews are one and the same is depriving Jewish communities of human diversity. That's a very anti-Semitic thing. The last point, very quickly, is that last year, when Israeli far-right Prime Minister Netanyahu received the likes of Viktor Orban, the anti-Semitic Prime Minister of Hungary, and other Eastern European leaders known to be authoritarian, racist, anti-Semitic, there were some noises in Israel. How could you receive those known anti-Semites? So one member of the Knesset from Likud, the same party as Netanyahu, said, quote, "They may be anti-Semites, but they're on our side," end of quote. I think that captures exactly how Israel is trying to propagate this very, very fraudulent definition of anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much, Omar. My next question is to Amy. Amy, you mentioned the silencing of the Palestinian voices within Australia and the difficulty we face in getting our voices heard on these shores. I would like to talk to you about how Indigenous Aboriginal voices are misrepresented in the media, and how does that contribute to the ongoing oppression of the Aboriginal people within Australia?
Yeah, I think historically Aboriginal voices have been completely oppressed and misrepresented in media, and it's only been through actually utilising our own forms of media, particularly independent media, and fostering our own journalists that we've been able to actually go against that. But it's just in the images that are used, in the way that, I'm just thinking of when we're talking about images of brutality against Aboriginal people and Black bodies, there's often, people don't believe us unless it's videotaped. So there's this appetite for the brutalization of our bodies in order to be believed. But even then, there just seems to be a devaluation, or there's a difference in the way they perceive Aboriginal people. And that comes from a long history of 200 years of these disparaging images being continually maintained and continually perpetrated against us. So I think it's continued to happen, and silencing happens in many different ways, and the media has actually been a force of violence against our people, I think, and has led to really brutal policy, for example, in the anti-intervention, which Randa mentioned. And so the media is a real tool used against us, and it's only, I feel like our own forms of media has been a way that we have been able to resist that. I don't have a lot of hope in the mainstream media, as we've seen in the fact that Palestinian voices, are totally silenced altogether and kept out, even in, as I said before, progressive publications. There's very few outlets in Australia in which Palestinian writers can actually are actually published free of really rigorous editing. And so I think it shows that, I mean, we have a very concentrated media space in Australia, very much owned by only a few people and very uniform in what they debate. We see, you know, the breakfast television, it's all, you know, pretty much white Australians. There's a very limited spectrum on which we can actually talk about issues. So it's really only been through independent media and forums like this that we're able to actually contest a lot of that. So I think a big problem is actually in, the way we see media concentrated in this country, and the fact that, you know, there's deliberate attempts to keep certain voices out, and the Black voices that we do have often the ones who are elevated are the ones who say what white Australia actually wants to hear. So that's a big problem, or, you know, their view of what success actually is. So that was like a really all around answer, but I see the media as, you know, a real part in why we're not seeing issues and perspectives that we need to see, and why we have the current level of debate that we do.
Thank you, Amy. My next question is going to be to Randa. Randa, you're a writer. You would be the perfect person to explain the importance of owning our own narrative, whether as Palestinians or as Aboriginals. When it comes to us trying to own our narrative, and I would ask the same question to Tony later as well. How important is it for us as Palestinians to own our narrative? And do you find it hard to be able to get your voice out there and own the narrative without trying to be without other people trying to hijack your own narrative and speak for you?
Yeah, well, I guess when we talk about sort of owning narratives, no one can take my narrative away from me. It's I think what we're talking about here is power, and in which spaces am I allowed to speak my truth, and in which spaces am I censored? And I think that from my point of view, especially as a writer who's in schools a lot, speaking to young people, for me, the real, and it might sound really trite, but the really critical thing that I've seen is that the narratives need to start through education right from the beginning, from, you know, primary, secondary, tertiary education systems need a complete decolonization. And it really needs to start in understanding. I cannot present my narrative as a Palestinian in Australia until Australia reckons with what race means in Australia. And I learned that through my studying of Islamophobia. I thought that I would study Islamophobia and understand what Islamophobia means. And I immediately confronted settler colonialism. I immediately confronted white supremacy and what whiteness means in Australia. And that meant for me that I cannot understand my narrative as a Palestinian. I cannot understand my narrative as a Muslim in a climate of Islamophobia and increasing racism and the normalization of hate speech until I understand what race means in this country. And so it's not just about me voicing my truth as one chapter in many chapters. It's about actually understanding that our narratives are connected, and that it's only going to make sense when that wider overarching narrative of what race means in Australia. What does it mean to be an Indigenous person in Australia? What does it mean to be a Palestinian in Australia? It means very often, what it does mean fundamentally is that you are allowed to speak until you start to dissent, until you start to push back against whiteness. That's when the censorship comes in, and that's when your narrative starts to be diluted and censored, and then that's when the pushback comes in. So I think it's very important that it's not just about me speaking my truth, it's about me understanding what my truth means in relation to Indigenous people and in relation to race in this country. And that's what I think is very critical in terms of storytelling, in terms of education, in terms of speaking about these struggles as connected. And that for me is the greatest kind of narrative that we need to start really getting into schools and into young people, because they get it. Honestly, when I go to schools and I present Palestinian conflict and I present Islamophobia, and I start with the fact that I am a settler of color, and I start with that colonial matrix I was talking about, young people get it. And if they don't get it, they ask the right questions, and they're the questions that aren't being responded to in curriculum. And I think that is key, that we need to address it from a young age and through curriculum.
100%, I agree. Starting from a young age would be the way to go. And I will have to ask the same question to Tony, because you're a writer yourself, and I found myself having, before asking you the question that I've got ready for you, I would like you to answer the same question. How hard is it, and how important is it for you to own your right to narrate as an Aboriginal writer?
Yeah, I'll probably answer in relationship to what the three speakers have said in a way, because they're related. I mean, one of the things about listening to Omar, so even though I would say I'm a person that goes out of my way to learn about the Palestinian struggle, is that listening to Omar speak, I realize immediately how refreshing it is to hear someone educating me, informing me. There's a richness in what Omar has said. So one of the important things is we need to have access to voices. We need to have access to, so our knowledge is replenished. And I have to go out of my way. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I have to go and look for those voices where, as Amy said, when the Palestinian writers and activists, speakers, philosophers in Australia get so limited access to the media, unless you go and seek it, you will not find that knowledge. So therefore, you're stuck with an existing narrative, which is either very false or very negative or misrepresentative. So I want to thank Omar for that. But I think for both Randa and Amy's points, it's about censorship, and it's about who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. So the notion of, I think with Randa is that she can speak and she can go to festivals as a novelist, but as soon as she starts to speak more assertively, more authoritatively, and dissents from that sort of mainstream narrative, people want to shut you up. People want to push you to the back of the line. And I think with Amy's point that's so relevant here is that there are particular Aboriginal voices that get access in mainstream media, but there are voices that fit the narrative that White Australia wants to hear. They are very misrepresentative of what most Aboriginal think and want. And I know this through last year going to many festivals where people fell over themselves to speak gloriously about the Uluru Statement. Now, while those words might be noble, what is behind those words and the limited appeal of so-called recognition or constitutional reform, most Aboriginal people, overwhelmingly that I know, are not in favour of that move. And when we speak against that type of approach of change, people get a shock because they think, are you a radical? Are you crazy? Whereas in fact, what I'm reflecting is often reflecting of just people I know on the ground. So that opinion, which I think is very nuanced, very sophisticated, very important critically, is never heard. And when it's never heard, it means that what many of us think and want can't be accessed by those who want to inform themselves. And I suppose to me personally, it's a bit like Randa. I'm not concerned about, do I personally get to tell my own story? I mean, I do because I talk too much. But the other issue is that I think again of those women who took up the struggle for the whole of the 20th century to make sure that our story was heard. These women were they're so disempowered. They're so marginal. You couldn't imagine, Aboriginal women have suffered such atrocity, such violence in Australia, and yet these heroic women they created our story. They put our story into the archive. As people know my work, when I wrote the novel The White Girl, a lot of the knowledge that I found for that book, some was from family, but a lot of it was the voices of women who had written letters of complaint for decades. So I never feel, oh, look, I can't be heard and it's too difficult. No one wants to listen to me. I just make demands based on the fact that I feel very privileged to have followed those women. So I feel overwhelmingly joyful about the opportunity to write and speak.
Thank you, Tony. My next question is to Omar. The Australian government is known to be one of, maybe I'll say one of the most unfriendly when it comes to the Palestinian cause, which is probably due to the fact that it is itself built on a settler colonial ideology. So it would be hard for it to oppose what was its own history at some stage. Do you think this is a major factor in Australia's stance towards Palestine and the Palestinian cause? Do you think that Australia tends to always be backing Israel in all its actions because pretty much it has a similar history to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians?
I think that's one factor, certainly. I mean, it's no coincidence that other settler colonies like Canada, the United States, and Australia are among the most anti-Palestinian governments on earth. It's just no coincidence. They are settler colonies. Their history of genocide against indigenous populations, First Nations in those respective countries, make them more accepting of Israel's narrative as another settler colony. But there are other factors as well. The complicity of the Australian state, Australian companies in Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid goes beyond ideology. There are some interests as well. Military corporations have a lot of interest in this. Cybersecurity, homeland security companies have a lot of common interest with Israel, and they try to learn a lot from the Israeli experience in repressing Palestinians, oppressing Palestinians. Israel, in fact, tries a lot of weapons on Palestinians in Gaza, on the Lebanese people, and then sells its weapons and its espionage technology and its facial recognition technology and so on to the world as field tested on us as guinea pigs. We, the indigenous Palestinians, are Israel's guinea pigs, and the weapons companies guinea pigs. So they try their weapons on us and sell it to the world. And Australia is part of that. With Australia's shift to the right, it is not just ignoring Palestinian rights, it's ignoring, obviously, Aboriginal rights as well. It's ignoring a lot of immigrants' rights and so on. Australia has shifted to the right on everything. We Palestinians are the easiest target. It's easy today to be racist against Arabs, racist against Muslims. You get away with that, even in the mainstream. Even in the US, mainstream media, Australian, well, forget Australian mainstream media, it's hardly media, but anyway, Rupert Murdoch kind of media is hardly media. But regardless, in this propaganda, Australian propaganda, it's easy to be anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racist, and you get away with that. It is not now, in the 21st century, it's not as easy, actually, to be racist against almost any other community. You don't easily get away with that. Of course, there's a lot of racism against everyone, especially Aboriginals, but we are the easiest target. And that's why many Black activists in the US, for example, know inherently that the struggle for Palestinian rights is also a struggle for all rights. We are the weakest link in a way, and they get away by punching at us, but they know that fighting for Palestinian rights is a fight for everyone's rights because we call for equal rights for everyone. So I think there's several factors, including business and so on, but there's complicity. And because Australia is a quasi-democratic country, you can call it that, it doesn't exactly represent its people, but I mean, people do put a piece of paper in a box and they think they have a say. So at least that can be used to affect policy change, to end complicity of universities, cultural institutions, and eventually government in Israel's crimes against Palestinians.
Yes, I agree. And I suppose if governments start with silencing Palestinian and indigenous voices, I suppose it'll go on silencing every other voice. No one will be.
No one is safe. No one is safe. Yeah.
Any of them would be silenced in the exact same way, I suppose. My next question is to Amy. Amy, you mentioned the appalling death of Mr. Ward in custody. We know that the life expectancy for the indigenous Palestinian is 10 years younger than the privileged Israeli illegal occupier. And it's ironically nearly the same age life expectancy difference between an Aboriginal and a non-indigenous person. It is 8.7 years here in Australia. I find the comparison compelling. It seems the results of colonizations are manifested in similar ways in both communities. The conditions of the Palestinians and those of the Aboriginals and Torres Islanders of Australia, the death rates of infants, the diseases, the medical needs, the suffering of the health system, the limited health facilities that are being built, death in custody. Tanya Day's case is one that is recent and is still in our mind. it proves that justice is a long way away. Unfortunately, I really don't want to be pessimistic, but it just, when you look at all this, you think it looks like justice is not, it's not near. It looks like it is a bit far away for us. How can you give us an overview on the ongoing impact of colonizations in the Aboriginal communities here in Australia?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we hear the statistics all the time, but it's very much a lived reality. In Aboriginal communities, there's funerals happening constantly. But I guess I just wanted to, I mean, Randa mentioned it before. There was a story I did earlier this week about a young boy. He was only 6 years old. He fell sick one day in the remote community of Bamaga, which is at the top of Cape York, NPA, in the most northern tip of Queensland. His parents did what, you know, any parent would do. They took him to the hospital. He got sent home with Panadol. He gradually grew sicker and sicker and sicker. So they took him back every single day. They took him back 6 times. By the time that he was admitted into hospital, he could barely walk. He couldn't keep food down. He was complaining of high fever, all indicators of what he would later die of, which was severe sepsis. And he later died about a week later. And so this story just, to me, I know about the violence in the health system. I know about racism in health. I know about the way Aboriginal children are treated, but that's still something I can't understand, how you can have a young child being taken so obviously sick to a doctor and him be continually turned away. And yet Australia seems to be like, I mean, this is the first we heard about it this week. And if his family hadn't done what they had to do to try and get his death investigated, we would have never heard about it. And so there are cases happening all over the country that most people haven't heard about. And it's always up to Aboriginal families to protest, but to go through this very hard, almost impossible process in order to get some form of justice, because justice is always elusive. And I think that's the problem. There's never any accountability. We saw this week there's no accountability over Ani Tanya Day's death. She had done nothing wrong. She was sleeping on a train. She was criminalized and she later died in custody because the people who are supposed to be caring for her just did not care. And that's what happens every single day in this country in different forms, in different ways. And Aboriginal people continue to resist in our own ways. And so often it does feel like that it's a very long road. And, you know, the fact that it is continual, it's a very hard thing to deal with. But I think that's what I find so inspiring about Aboriginal people all over the country, is that the fight just never ends. And it might not be something that's visible, and it might not be something that's palatable to white Australia or, you know, able to even be acknowledged, but it's continuing. And I think that's what's happening in Palestine as well. The fight just never ends, and it takes different forms in ways that sometimes you can't even see. And so my work is really in looking at media representations of violence against Aboriginal women, but I'm looking particularly at the fact that it's not just the violence that might have ended a woman's life, but it's the continual shows of resistance against multiple intersecting layers of violence throughout their lives. And we find that women, in my research, Aboriginal women are always fighting. So I think, I mean, I'm almost like echoing what Randa and Tony and Omar are saying, but it's just the fact that, you know, we never stop fighting. And I think that's what we have to have hope for, I guess.
Thank you so much, Amy. Definitely, I think resistance is a woman, for sure. My last question to Tony, but before I ask the question, I just want to remind everyone of the audience to type their questions in the Q&A box, because very soon we're running a little bit over time, but I'm sure everyone's enjoying listening to all our wonderful speakers. So I'll ask this question to Tony, and then after that we'll go to the Q&A questions from the audience. So I just remind everyone to type their questions. My question to you, Tony, is the Rio Tinto destruction of the 46,000-year-old Jokan Gorge, which is a highly significant Aboriginal rock shelter, and it's a crucial cultural, has a crucial culture significance, not only for Aboriginal, but for the world. Rio Tinto wanted to expand its iron ore mine in order to access what they claimed to be a high volume of high-grade iron ore. When they admitted themselves that they had 3 other options and they still chose the 4th, how do you see this as a historian? Do you see that it is a lack of understanding of the Aboriginal history? Is it lack of care for what is significant for Aboriginal heritage? Is it a typical colonizer's behavior? And what are the tools that you see that we have to protect and preserve Aboriginal existence on this land?
Well, it's all of what you said. There's a relative point here, though, to start, because you're asking about protection. And I want to just link this to what Amy just talked about in relationship to violence against women. This is one of the reasons I want to clarify and make certain that there is so little hope for us if we put hope in what we call constitutional recognition. Within the Australian Constitution and within legislation with any of the states, these crimes that have been committed should be protected under law. So in other words, the assault of a woman, the death of a woman in custody, the destruction of land should be protected under constitutional and state law, but we're abused by the law. So my point being that there are laws in place that should protect the person's life that do not protect the lives of Aboriginal people. So we should not and cannot put faith in a legal or constitutional system and asking that it will protect us. Because people who are racist, people who value you less than the rest of society, they ignore the law, or the justice that underpins law is not carried out. When Auntie Tanya dies, and Auntie Tanya Day's coronial inquest was held, and when we talk about what happened to that woman, the obvious violence that occurred, and yet we can find that no one is held responsible. And as Auntie Tanya Day's family members have said recently, that in the 400 deaths of Aboriginal people in custody since the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody, not one person has ever been held accountable for those deaths, or those deaths could have been protected in law. So it's important to make that point. In regard to Rio Tinto's actions specifically, and you did say as a historian, so I'll answer this as a historian. Historically, many Indigenous sites around Australia were destroyed in a very willful way. And again, people in Palestine will understand this, the destruction of your sacred, secular, cultural sites at the hands of Israel. This is the willful destruction of spiritual places of Aboriginal people to, in a sense, create that silence that we've already talked about tonight, to destroy the narrative, to destroy the ability of country to speak. So working as a historian, I'd written and published a lot about this in the past, where spiritual sacred sites in Victoria were destroyed wantonly by mining companies, by vandals, by local councils, by all sorts of people wanting to erase the reality of tens of thousands of years of Aboriginal narrative, the presence of Aboriginal stories spiritually and visually on that landscape. What I think is different about the behavior of Rio Tinto and the behavior of some mining companies, while some mining companies have been responsible for destroying sacred sites in a wanton way, in other words, that same willful way, I think we're in a worse situation now, because I think our sacred sites are being destroyed dismissively. In other words, it's not that these sites are of value to Aboriginal people, therefore we must destroy them because otherwise they recognise an Aboriginal presence. I think when you look at the comments by some of the people coming out of that organisation, they simply do not value the fact that these sites matter. They didn't even matter to these people. And when you think that the executives of Rio Tinto, their way of addressing this was to cut their own bonuses for a year. Now, just think about this. We're talking about people on multi-million-dollar salaries, and their ability to recognise the harm they have done is to simply say, I won't be paid a bonus this year. I won't lose my salary. I won't be held accountable. This is criminal action which will never be brought before the courts. I just won't have my bonus. Now, I don't know if that means they won't go to Bali next year or the Bahamas. I don't know what that means. but it means these people will never be held accountable. In fact, I find the fact that they can monetize this and say, well, the compensation we will give to Aboriginal people is that we won't take our bonus. In other words, the Aboriginal people still lose their sight. The Aboriginal people don't get any monetary or cultural compensation. We just won't take a holiday bonus. I think it's deeply insulting. And the fact that they say that and claim that that is a form of justice, to me, again, it indicates that their sense of what a sacred site means is they don't even have a concept in this case. They're completely dismissive of it. And I think that goes to what has been said in a range of issues tonight, is that when Amy asked, how could it be that a mother and father could take a sick child into a hospital and suffer that extreme discrimination, it must be because that child's life is not valued. It must be. And when you think, well, how could someone in the medical profession do that? Again, I don't think it's done wantonly. It's done because a person does not give value to that life of that Aboriginal child as they might another child. And that is frightening to consider. It's not something that unfortunately surprises me, but it's still very frightening to consider. And I'm sure it's the experience of the Palestinian guests and audience that we have tonight as well.
I'm sure it's the same case in Palestine as well. Now, this last question is for both Randa and Omar. It's been said that Israel doesn't know how to fight a non-violence movement. Therefore, it does all it can do to fight BDS. Israel only understands the language of violence, only understands silencing people by force, breaking activists' bones in the first Intifada, and fighting children holding stones with bullets in the second Intifada. So when it comes to a non-violent movement, Israel stands completely powerless. Do you think that Israel is definitely failing on a grassroots level? How much do you see the BDS changing the political game on the ground? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, please. Omar and Randa.
Well, I think Omar is probably the best person as the founder of BDS to answer that. I'll let you answer, Omar, so that I can answer another question so I don't take up too much time.
Sure, I think indeed Israel does not know how to fight BDS well. They have failed at the grassroots level. In fact, in one confrontation between the Israeli army and non-violent protesters against the wall in a village in Palestine, Bil'in, this Israeli army commander said, "We don't do Gandhi very well." That's a quote. Indeed, they don't do Gandhi very well. They don't know what to do with non-violent protesters. They try to suppress us. They try to do everything to smear us, to bully us, to intimidate us, and nothing is working. We keep going. So what Israel has resorted to with massive, massive financial, intelligence, political, diplomatic expenditure is to suppress us from above. After failing at the grassroots level, they're trying to pass laws to undermine our movement at the legal level. They run into problems in countries that respect the freedom of expression, unlike Australia, even like the US. The US has horrible problems, but the US has one thing that's very good going for it, which is true respect for freedom of expression. It's in the US Constitution. In the US, Israel is running into trouble with this. They've passed anti-BDS legislation in some 30 state legislatures across the US. But in the few challenges that reached the federal courts decided anti-BDS legislation go against the First Amendment of the US Constitution, the Freedom of Expression Amendment. So Israel is really trying to push a new McCarthyism, if you will. And in this new McCarthyism, loyalty to Israel is the key. And anyone who dares to question Israel is attacked as the new communist, as the first McCarthyism used to attack everyone as a communist. Now, as a supporter of Palestine, anti-Israel, then they push the repression buttons and try to suppress you. But indeed, that's not succeeding. With all the repression at the government level, at the grassroots level, we are winning. With women's groups, trade unions, LGBT groups, students, academics, Jewish groups, we're winning.
Definitely, we are winning. Thank you very much for answering these questions. Before I turn to the Q&A from the audience, I have to apologize that we have gone over time, but it has been a very fruitful discussion. I could not stop the questions. I just wanted to mention that there is an important event coming up. The Edward Said Memorial Lecture is going to be on Saturday, the 17th of October. It will be with the Honorable Melissa Park, whom we all as Palestinians have the utmost respect for. The event is organized by the Australian Friends of Palestine and is an online Zoom event as well. It is not to be missed, so be sure to register soon by going to the Australian Friends of Palestine website. And now it's time for us to turn to the Q&A from the audience. The first question I have here, are the right voice missing represented from the Palestinian leadership? So questions about leadership in Palestine. If we have the correct voices, are they missing in the Palestinian leadership? No, who you would like
Randa,
to
Randa, would you like to start?
Okay, I can start. I always feel that this kind of a question is slightly disingenuous and or distracting, that it sort of again shifts the blame of an occupied, people who are fighting a state which is funded and supported by the US and other powers, to then be held accountable as though the reason that they are in the mess that they are in because of their leadership. We know very well that there are complete problems with Palestinian leadership, that the Palestinian Authority is basically Israel's subcontractor. But if you want to address that, if you want to actually if you want to say that the only way that the Palestinian people can achieve justice and can achieve their equal rights and can achieve dismantling apartheid and settler colonialism and discrimination, that is that they just elect the right leaders, then I think that is disingenuous and completely fails to miss the point that the blame is squarely at the feet of Israel, and Israel has the power to change the situation, and that it is not up to the Palestinians. And in fact, when Palestinians exercised their democratic rights, what that got them was the imprisonment of Gaza, the punishment of Gaza, collective punishment. And so even if you were to string the argument that the Palestinians don't understand democracy and they can only be led by dictators, the kind of nonsense that you hear propagandists and the kind of things that I get in my emails after any public event I do, if only you had the right leaders, you don't understand democracy. Even when Palestinians exercise their democratic rights to elect the leaders that they choose, they are collectively punished for doing so. And so I think that the real question is not Palestinian leadership, which we all recognize it has serious flaws, but Israel. Israel here is the colonial occupying power.
Thank you so much, Randa. This question is to Amy. I know that Amy will have to leave us soon, so I'll direct the questions to her first. The establishment, just a sec, let's see which one was, sorry, I think I've looked. Sorry, Amy. It was here and then it disappeared. Okay, question to Amy Mcquire. I think you said that Palestine is censored in left and Indigenous media in Australia. If that is so, can you give us example of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind saying it. I've actually had the experience in Indigenous media where they didn't want to publish a piece on Palestine that had been written by 3 Aboriginal writers, 3 Palestinian writers, and 3 Jewish writers. And it was in relation to the cultural boycott of Israel, in relation to an Aboriginal singer going over to Eurovision. And I think the thing I found most horrible about the excuses to why they would not publish is if you had used the same excuse in relation to why you wouldn't publish an Aboriginal piece, in relation, the excuse was that there weren't, I can't really remember fully, but the excuses were exactly the type of excuses sort of mainstream publication would use if you weren't going to publish a piece in relation to Aboriginal affairs. And so I know that there's still ongoing, I think for me, what I've found is the importance of publishing independently and fostering as many independent voices as possible, because I just don't see, you know, mainstream media as a solution at all, and even some sections, I guess, of media. And so I know that it does happen, and that, you know, there is a very limited avenue in which to talk about these issues. But I also think it's just something where we have to continue to do the work, because I know that there's things I should be reading. I need to be continually working and to continuing building my knowledge and everything like that. So that's why I say it definitely does happen. And I think, like, as Omar said, the solidarities are organic, but it's also something that we have to work towards. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and yet I think the foundation is there. Tony mentioned we had a Black Palestinian forum recently. So the foundation is there, but I think it's something that we continually have to work on.
Okay, and before you leave, Amy, one last question so that you can be free to leave when you want to. You mentioned that G4S and their involvement in deaths in custody. Is there a campaign or a potential for a campaign linking G4S here and in Palestine? Do you think there would be something like that?
And apologies to everyone, I just have to go pick up my kids. But yeah, well, that's why I actually started thinking of Mr. Ward when I listened to Omar's speech where he mentioned G4S. But I just started to think of all the, you know, the security contractors, but everyone who's making money off the incarceration of Aboriginal people. There's a lot of money that is being made and people who are profiting off this. It's a whole industry. And so that's why I started thinking, well, that's actually the real importance of movements like BDS. It's making that visible. And I think that's something we have to start looking at, you know, where the money is going and who is profiting off our oppression. And why are these systems continually working? You know, why are people continually dying? So I don't know, I think there is some sort of links behind that. And as I mentioned before, Serco has the $1 billion contract at the moment, and contracts all over Australia, including immigration centres, detention centres. So there are real links that we have to make. And I think movements like BDS, it's, you know, sort of powerful tools in which we can make those links.
Thank you so much. This question is for Omar and Randa as well, but the question is, what is the structure, framework, or process for collaboration around global decolonization and human rights? Is there a need use for universal boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or are there better ways of amplifying common cause across colonized people and winning decolonization everywhere? Omar?
Okay, I think it's a very broad question, very difficult, but a very broad question. I think BDS Universal, as the person who wrote this question said, a universal boycott campaign or divestment campaign against an intersectional target that harms many people of color, for example, like G4S, like Hewlett-Packard, like military companies, Elbit Systems, and so on. It would be great to have a universal campaign, but that's only one aspect that brings those anti-colonial struggles together. There are many levels where we can work together at the intellectual, academic level, at the cultural level, exploring our cultural heritage, which colonizers have always relentlessly tried to suppress, appropriate, destroy any mention of our heritage. Exploring the commonalities of indigenous cultures is also a part of that. So I think it's really broad, but yes, certainly I agree. A common boycott campaign against a common target would make a lot of sense. And it's been tried. G4S, for example, there was a group in the United States, more than 1,000 Black activists, intellectuals, feminists, and so on, established Black for Palestine, and their #1 target was G4S, and they focused on how G4S is oppressing Palestinians and oppressing Blacks, mostly Blacks in the United States.
The question also talks about global decolonisation, and I think that there's a bit of a risk there in flattening all decolonial struggles in sort of, or suggesting that there is only one sort of universal tactic. And I think that even, you know, when you listen to Tony, you can see that every Indigenous struggle has its own nuances, its own diversity, its own conversations around how to achieve decolonisation. And I think it's really important that we, even though the objectives are the same, you know, justice, liberation, you know, sovereignty, self-determination, even though these are universal struggles and universal principles, how to achieve them, I still think needs to be specific. It needs to be led from the grassroots by Indigenous people themselves, and rather than imposing a universal way of doing that, which I think is kind of a little bit of suggested in the question. But I agree with Omar that the collaboration is already happening, and we saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd, and the sort of organic way that these collaborations and connections happen around decolonisation across the globe is already happening, and it's very, very encouraging.
Thank you, Randa. I've got this question for Tony. This question is about who was the woman from the 1915 that you referred to. I'd like you to mention her name live, if that's okay.
I won't, and I'll explain why. It's simply that I won't mention the woman's individual name because I would have to speak to her family before I would do that in a public forum. But I'm sure the question is asked with respect, so I'd like to give the questioner something to understand, is that I did a lot of work when I was working as a historian. One of my major research projects was in fact to look at the writing of Aboriginal women who had been incarcerated in the reserves and mission system in Victoria from about the 1860s onwards. One of the reasons I wanted to do that is that I think the ultimate, and we talked about this at the opening, of the control of our bodies, the destruction of our bodies. If we look at the history of racism and violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, while we all historically bear the brunt of that, the attack on women has been most pronounced. And it is most pronounced because if you want to destroy the identity of Indigenous people, you literally need to control the reproductive rights of Indigenous women. In other words, to destroy their ability to give birth to the children that they want to. So all sorts of insidious practices have been used historically, violent practices, to really destroy Aboriginal women's autonomy. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this research was to give voice to grassroots women who were unknown, who were not known. And I would say to the questioner, this woman was a heroic woman, but there are many of them. There are many of them who come from all the nations in Victoria. And I know that if other Indigenous people are in the audience tonight, these struggles are replicated from women across the nation. It's important to also say to the questioner that one of the reasons I did the research is that when the 1997 Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission report, the Stolen Generations report, was released, one of the shocking responses, by the way, in mainstream media, was that the women who'd given testimony to that inquiry had in fact lied, or they'd suffered from false memory syndrome. It's another attempt, as we've talked about tonight, to silence our story. So I did the research to say, no, these women didn't lie. These is historically their stories. And for the questioner, for anyone who's interested, you can go to the Australian Archives Office, you can go to the Public Records Office in Victoria, and you will find hundreds and hundreds, thousands of words, tens of thousands of words written by Aboriginal women right across this state. And you can find out who their names are, and you can remember them, and you can speak their names. So I think that's important to recognise. So the only reason I'm not giving this particular person's name tonight is because I wouldn't do that without permission of the family. And one of the things that we do is Aboriginal people and Randa, we talked about this in about your own story. When I do research around Aboriginal women's writing, what I do at the conclusion of that research is make sure that that research is made available to the family. So to give the family the letters that I've researched, so they get first look at it. So they decide what they want to do with it. So it's important. It's important to note that. And I suppose the other thing to say, it's again in relationship to issues of collaboration and solidarity. This is why it matters to me, as I said earlier, to hear Randa speak, to hear Omar speak, to be so fortunate to hear the Palestinian speakers at our gathering last year, is that we grow up of people being talked about. We grow up about Palestinian people being spoken about. To get to speak to people in a first-hand way, it changes everything. Even if the voices are sympathetic, even if the voices are so-called allies who supposedly support the Palestinian cause, it is nothing in comparison to hearing people speak to you about their own story. The energy, the power of the story can only be understood if you're hearing it from the person who has experienced it. And this is why I did the research I did, and this is why, again, I'm so fortunate to be involved in an event like this.
Thank you, Tony. Omar, I've got this more than one question about the same topic, so I'll have to mention this question. It's about, they'd like you to comment on Norman Finkelstein's position on BDS. We know that he is a supporter of the Palestinian cause, but at the same time, he is anti-BDS. Would you like to comment on that?
No, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't? Okay, no problem. Okay. Let's find another question. Okay, this question: Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is often justified through the proposition that Jews have the status of an indigenous people in historic Palestine. In Australia, the Zionist lobby tries to make common cause with Aboriginal activists. So I'm wondering what the speakers, and especially Amy and Tony, and of course, any of our speakers is more than welcome to answer that, would say to the claims that Jews are indigenous to Palestine in the same way that Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders people are indigenous to the country.
Do you want me to answer that, or
You can, if you, both of you, each one from their perspective. You can say it from an indigenous Aboriginal point of view, and then Omar can speak from the Palestinian point of view.
Well, I don't know if people are aware of this, but there were attempts to establish a Zionist state in Australia, in the Northern Territory. This is way back, I think. Although I'm a historian, my dates on this are not all that accurate, but it certainly was well before the establishment of the Jewish state. I think that it's to suggest that there's that affinity because Zionism claims of Jewish people being indigenous to the land of the Palestinian people. I actually personally, I mean, I regard it as an insult, but I also think that what's at stake here is that the notion that people try and co-opt your struggle to justify attacks on other people, it's ridiculous to make such a claim. I know that, again, that there have been links between some Aboriginal people, conservative Aboriginal people and Israel, and they continue today. And again, I think what's unfortunate about that is that those links are between quite individual Aboriginal people who get a lot of air in the media, as opposed to those of us in the majority who have great support for the people of Palestine. So I think it's a ludicrous proposition to be put, and I think it's disingenuous, and I think it's, yeah, obviously incredibly disrespectful to Aboriginal people. I will note, and I think Omar made a wonderful point about, this is not, the Palestinian cause, and certainly the movement is not a movement that is anti-Semitic or prejudicial towards Jewish people. The State of Israel is a different entity. We know that there's a very famous issue in Australia when an Aboriginal rights campaigner, William Cooper, after Crystal Night, he made a deputation to the German Consul General in Melbourne and petitioned him and presented a letter in opposition to the shocking violence being done against Jewish people in Germany. And what I want to make, as Omar suggested earlier, is that this is not about the relationships between Jewish people and Aboriginal people. I have remarkable friendships with secular Jewish and activist Jewish people in Melbourne, and people who actually have a great sense of what the Aboriginal struggle is about. And I really value those people. Those same people would equally think that the notion that Zionists would claim an affinity with Aboriginal people as you know, equally Indigenous just doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, maybe I'm giving it too much of a response than it deserves.
Okay, would you like Omar to say a few words about this as well?
Sure. Yes, Palestine, unlike Australia, has been conceived as in the center of the old civilizations, and it was colonized by so many civilizations. I mean, Australia was spared that until the white Europeans discovered, quote unquote, Australia. But we've been discovered much, much earlier, and we've been colonized by every power. So I think every people on earth almost can claim to be kind of indigenous to Palestine. The Palestinians are not a pure people. We're such a mix of races and ethnicities and civilizations, from the Persians to the Egyptians to the Romans to the French to the, I mean, everyone has, to the Mongols, everyone has colonized Palestine. And we're proud of that. We're not a pure people as such. So we've always had a Jewish component of Palestinian, what we call today the Palestinian people. The indigenous people of Palestine have had Jewish Palestinians for so many centuries, and that's something we're proud of. As we've had many Christians and Muslims and others, and as I said, from every culture and every ethnicity you can imagine. But does that give European Jewish settlers a right to ethnically cleanse the indigenous Palestinians and claim this land as their colony and as an empty land that had no one living there? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The Crusaders have stayed in Palestine for hundreds of years. Does that give the British and the French and the Italians and today's Spaniards and so on a right to claim, oh, then Palestine is ours? We've had a presence there for hundreds of years. Absolutely not. I mean, it doesn't work this way. Whatever the indigenous people of Palestine were made of, and we are made of a mix, we are the indigenous people of Palestine. We include Jews and Muslims and Christians and many, many others. But no one, Europeans or otherwise, have a right to colonize us, to settle this land and claim that it doesn't belong to us. That there's absolutely no connection there. And I absolutely agree with Tony that Israel is trying to co-opt indigenous communities in Australia, in Canada, in the US, with a lot of money, with a lot of media availability and so on, to try to say, oh, we belong to the same culture. No, Aboriginals in Australia, First Nations in Canada and the United States and Latin America have nothing to do with a settler colony that's an apartheid state, an occupier, and an absolute criminal that's perpetrating war crimes and crimes against humanity to this day, as we're seeing with the bombing of Gaza to this day.
Thank you very much, Omar. Very well said. I'm going to ask each one of you to give me a quick word to end before we end our wonderful conversation today. I'll start with Randa. Can you please give us a few words, please?
I guess I would like to say that there are many times when, as a Palestinian, as a Muslim, I felt a loss of hope. I felt quite a lot of despair about the rights that we're constantly losing, about the violence of the settler state. And like Tony said, I too felt that the moments in which I felt the most galvanized, the most energized, the most infused with hope and constructive hope about what we can do forward is when I realized that these are shared struggles and that we are stronger as a collective. And I think that the reason why Israel and white settler Australia are so in such a panic about this nonviolent movement, about these collective solidarities, is because that critical mass is building. And so I want to leave a message mainly to young people who are watching this, to say that there has never been a better time to be on the side of justice and be a freedom fighter, because this is a side that is mobilizing and it is growing in this critical mass of people who understand that you cannot fight alone in isolation, that we fight together, and that gives me so much hope. So thank you so much for having me tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor.
Randa. Tony, I'd love to hear from you, please.
Sure. I want to reiterate what Randa said, and also to finish, to go back to something she said in an earlier comment, and that is that what I need to be sure of is that while I do feel and hope that I have great affinity with the Palestinian struggle, and that I love the conversation that we've had tonight, I love all the conversations, that it will always be a process of learning. You know, I'm a bit hesitant sometimes to answer a question where I think, well, I really don't know enough to answer this question, because I'm in a process of learning. I'm in the process of learning about the struggle of people who I care deeply about. Because one of the things that Randa said earlier is that, you know, there's something quite specific about each of the struggles that we're involved in. So we do have a shared struggle. We do have a shared sense of solidarity, which I think really enriches us and energizes us. But we also need to be respectful of the specificity of what we're dealing with. One of the issues here would be to think about Black Lives Matter, and has already been discussed here tonight. It is a remarkable movement. It is a remarkable movement that has very specific connotations, obviously, to African Americans and people of color in the US. And of course, it has become a global movement. But what we need to be a little bit careful of is that we don't get caught up in simply just that sloganeering of a movement, or the sort of public display of protest around a movement, and recognize that what we're each dealing with here, what people are dealing with in Palestine, the injustices that are occurring in the US, the injustices that occur in Indigenous colonial societies all around the world, and what's happening in Australia, we also need to understand and learn about the specific ramifications of what we're involved in. So in Australia, it is important to say Aboriginal lives matter, Indigenous lives matter, because what's happening in Australia is quite specific to this country. It is about what is happening with Palestinian people. It's attack on people and an attack on land. The colonial state attacks people and attacks land with the same sort of violence. It's why my work in climate justice links these two issues. The destruction, the violent destruction of land, and the violent destruction of people go hand in hand. So what I want to go away with tonight, and again, thinking about not only young people, but someone a bit over the hill like myself, is that we're in a process of giving solidarity and support to each other, because it does make us stronger, but it's a lifelong campaign of learning. And again, meeting Omar tonight, talking to people, is that I feel the other issue is that I always need to be learning about what's happening in the lives of other people, rather than simply think, okay, I can just align myself to that struggle because we share something in common. We share many things in common, but we need to be respectful of, as the first question or one of the first questions that Randa was addressed to Randa, is that we each need to own our own story. Therefore, we must listen to the story of other people who we're in solidarity with. And for me, it's important to make sure I listen as much as I do talk about my own interests. So thank you again very much, because I have, as I would expect, I've learned a lot tonight.
Thank you so much, Tony. We have learned a lot as well tonight from you. And now to Omar. Omar, if you'd like to give us a few
Yes, yes, you cannot imagine how honored, how humbled I am. This is my very first direct experience of conversing with, having a dialogue with such inspiring Aboriginal figures from Australia. We've had a lot of work with Black figures in the United States, elsewhere in Europe, in Latin America, in South Africa. We have many, but I've never had such an enriching, truly inspiring conversation with Aboriginal Australian figures like yourself, Tony, and like Amy. I've learned a lot. And Randa, thank you so much. Your closing was just so eloquent. It says it all. Indeed, our struggles are nuanced. There's no one size fits all in resistance movements. We've got to tailor our resistance to suit our own particularities without ignoring the universality of the rights we're calling for. So yes, there's a lot of common ground, and that brings us together. We're fighting for justice, but everyone in their own way to suit their own particularities. Black Lives Matter in the US inspires us tremendously. We see it as the forefront of global struggles against fascism, against white supremacy, and that inspires us all. So despite the repression, despite the killings, despite the bombing of Gaza, despite all what Israel is doing, apartheid Israel is doing to kill our spirit, we maintain hope, we hold on to hope, and not in a romantic way, in a very realistic way, because we know that we can and shall prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I would like to thank all our speakers, firstly for accepting our invitation, and then for enlightening us with all these informations and being with us, connecting both struggles together. Thank you for your valuable work, for fighting injustice here in Australia, in Palestine, and everywhere. To our valuable audience, I urge you to dig under the surface of what you see in the mainstream media to find the truth, to discover that the only crime in the eye of the colonizer is the fact that we do exist. We are here. This is our only crime. I remind us and all of what Angela Davis once put profoundly: freedom is a constant struggle, and both our people are ready to continue raising our voices until they're heard. Thank you for your solidarity, and good night.